I'm Kara Holsapple, and this is Trump on Earth.
It'll be all right. We'll be okay.
I thought the windows were gonna shatter because it was just so hot.
Wildfires have once again spread across California, and millions of residents have been living without power for weeks.
This is an important safety alert from Pacific Gas and Electric Company. To protect public safety, PG&E may also temporarily turn off power in your neighborhood or community.
The deliberate blackouts by the Pacific Gas and Electric Company, or PG&E, are an attempt to prevent power lines from starting new fires, a real possibility in dry and windy conditions. Hundreds of the fires that started last year in California are believed to have been sparked by equipment from power companies, including the state's deadliest fire.
It's everywhere? It's everywhere. It's a major fire. It's already crossing the Paradise Fire. Sorry, I gotta go.
It's just getting big by the second. It's like my whole backyard smoking is coming up to my house. Did anyone come on Pest Road right now and come to my house? Stop it.
Go ahead and evacuate. We have the fire department inbound. What's your address?
I'm trying, but I think it's blocking the road.
Ma'am, get out as fast as you can, okay?
Okay.
Bye.
The Camp Fire was caused by a faulty electric transmission line. 85 people died, and the town of Paradise was leveled. Some have called for nationalizing PG&E to keep it accountable for the safety and maintenance of its equipment and the reliability of its service. Across the country, there's a patchwork of grids providing power to Americans, and they still mostly rely on fossil fuels to keep a steady flow of electricity. A couple of years ago, President Trump signed an executive order to speed up environmental reviews and approvals of infrastructure projects that are a high priority for the country, like making improvements to the grid. Meanwhile, the Trump administration has created policies to prop up financially struggling coal and nuclear power plants to ensure the electricity grid is resilient and reliable. But the main character in a new book by Wall Street Journal energy reporter Russell Gold looks beyond fossil fuels to power the grid. The book focuses on one man's mission to get more renewable wind energy online and into American homes and businesses through transmission lines and a more thoughtful connection of the nation's grids. The book is called Superpower. First of all, I just want to thank you for taking the time to talk with me.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to talk with you about your latest book, Superpower, because it is the most engaging piece of writing that I have read on renewable energy.
Thank you.
It's a nonfiction book, but your protagonist is Michael Skelly. And just say a little bit about his background and who he is.
Yeah, sure. So Michael Skelly is a fascinating character. He was a Peace Corps volunteer, went down to Costa Rica, came back and decided he wanted to go to Harvard Business School. But when he was coming out of Harvard Business School, felt that he wanted the most interesting job of any of his classmates, and he also wanted to make sure he never wore a tie. And the job he eventually found was to go back to Costa Rica and built, I believe it was the first tram that you could take to travel through the rainforest. He built that, and then he sort of looked around and said, well, what else do I want to do? I kind of enjoy the challenge of building a big project. And so he got into building renewable energy. And this is in the 1990s. Renewable energy really hadn't started to take off yet. But he ended up coming back to the United States and being the chief development officer for one of the first renewable energy companies in the United States, and built some very small wind farms in Pennsylvania, actually not too far from Pittsburgh, and in Minnesota and California and sort of many places. And about 8 years later, 2008, the company was sold and formed the basis of one of the biggest wind energy companies in the United States right now.
Yeah, so Skelly got really good at setting up successful wind power stations across the country. He knows how to generate wind regionally, but the real question is how to get it to more customers, how to get more of it online. So the meat of your book is sort of when Skelly turns his attention to the idea of transmitting wind power across the country. And it doesn't go smoothly. What happens? What kind of obstacles does he face?
No, it certainly doesn't. Right. Well, so Skelly, and everyone calls him Skelly. No, I've never met anyone who calls him Michael. Skelly, once the wind business that he was in was sold, was looking around, and he sort of came to the conclusion that the one thing holding back renewable energy was that they needed more transmission lines. And what I mean by that is there are parts in the middle of the country, in Oklahoma and the Texas Panhandle and Kansas, where you can generate, the wind is just phenomenal there, and you can generate lots of energy at a really low price. It's just there's not many people out there. There's not many factories. There's not much demand for the wind. And so he realized that in order to make a big difference, he wanted to try to build transmission. And what that is are just transmission lines are very big electrical lines that can move power over long distances. And so he set out to build a privately funded transmission line that would go from the Oklahoma Panhandle all the way across Oklahoma, across Arkansas, and into Tennessee. And the reason he wanted to get into Tennessee is that the Tennessee Valley Authority has just a great transmission network there. They were planning to build somewhere about 24 nuclear power plants at one point, but they only ended up building 8 or 9. So they had lots of excess transmission. So if you could get it across the Mississippi into the Memphis area, then you can piggyback on existing transmission and, frankly, get the power anywhere you needed it. Atlanta, Philadelphia, Washington, up into Pittsburgh. And so that was his plan. And encountered lots of sort of difficulties along the way. Mostly that the way we've set up our power system, we've created these regional energy utilities, these little states within electricity. Someone once made the observation, which I think is absolutely true, that we don't have a single electrical system in the United States. We have 50 different systems. Every state has its own system, and every state is looking very much inward to develop its own grid and to make sure its people are served. Nobody was looking at the ways in which, if you tie together multiple states, you can have benefits, and it was a real problem. And you know, he encountered a lot of incumbent utilities and also politicians who frankly just didn't want to change the status quo, who were very happy with the way things are.
Yeah, he was offering energy to the Tennessee Valley Authority at pretty rock bottom prices.
Unbelievably low prices.
Lower than coal, certainly, and even natural gas.
Well, that's one of the fascinating things that's happened in the last few years is that if you can generate electricity from wind and increasingly from solar at a price that's lower than you can, than it costs to burn coal to generate electricity. And natural gas has also it's sort of getting to natural gas prices also. So this has been a huge change. It used to be renewables were this sort of very niche product. Maybe you felt good about it, but, let's face it, they were really expensive. 10, 15 years ago, that was absolutely true. It is no longer true. Purely from a generating perspective, putting everything else to the side, the low-cost source of electricity right now is wind, period.
And we should say the reason that Tennessee or states in the Southeast might want to buy wind energy from the plains and from the West is because it's not that easy to generate wind power in the Southeast. The wind is not reliable.
The wind is not, there's not very much wind. There was one wind farm in Tennessee. It only generates electricity about 20% of the time, and it's visible from pretty much everywhere you go within Knoxville. Now, compare that to what goes on in the Great Plains. These wind turbines are not up on top of mountains. They're not blocking view sheds. And a good location will generate wind 50, 60% of the time. It's a huge difference.
So a theme in the book is the role of states and the federal government when it comes to keeping the lights on for Americans. There's a long history you go through in the book, right up to the present, of states or even local communities opposing the transmission of wind or other power across state lines, which really doesn't directly benefit them. But advocates like Skelly argue that we all benefit from cleaner power as a nation. Has this tension been resolved in any way?
No, this tension's very much still there. I mean, this is one of the things when you write about energy, which I've done for a long time, that you keep coming across time and again. And it's sort of the what's in it for me perspective. There were one of the big holdups in this transmission line that Skelly proposed was that the people of Arkansas, where the line was crossing, were sort of saying, well, what do we get from this? And they were being offered jobs. They were being offered some of the power, but they just felt like, look, this is being imposed on us. We don't want to do this. And we've seen this before. We saw it up in Minnesota when, in the 1970s, when there's this now forgotten, what was called an energy war, where the farmers of Minnesota literally went to war and tried to stop a power line from being built across their land because they didn't feel like they were getting anything from it. You know, the power grid in the United States has the potential to bring us all together, to deliver electricity from one part of the country to another when they need it, and sometimes at a price that's beneficial. We all can benefit from it, but it's not going to work if everyone sort of looks at, you know, in their backyard and say, well, what's in this for me? I don't want this. It's a struggle that we come across time and again. And, you know, I wrote about it in this current book, Superpower, but I also wrote about it in my last book, The Boom, about fracking, where you had people sort of saying, look, definitely people in Pennsylvania, around Pittsburgh and out in north central Pennsylvania, who were generating all this natural gas that was going to the cities and elsewhere, and other people were benefiting from them. And they were saying, well, you know, why do we have to be the ones who sacrifice to generate all this natural gas? You know, I found a similar resistance with renewable energy, which frankly really surprised me, because renewable energy transmission lines, they don't pollute. And frankly, you know, once they're installed, you kind of tend to forget where they are.
Well, Michael Skelly was looking to work with the Department of Energy on this transmission project, which ultimately failed. The government steps in when it comes to pipelines that carry oil and gas across states. How is wind energy and renewables different?
It's completely different. If you want to build a gas or an oil pipeline from one state to the next, you know exactly what to do. You know what office to go to within FERC and the Department of Energy and what forms to file. The process has been established. If you want to build a transmission line from Oklahoma to Memphis, it's not clear who gives you permission, who has to give permission. I mean, one of the things Skelly faced was just, you know, none of this had been done before. And, you know, he had to be the first one through and to kind of go through all the legal processes and the bureaucratic processes. And that's a problem, because one of the things I learned in researching and writing my book, Superpower, was that it's pretty clear that we could get, as the United States, to 70, 80% renewable energy without raising the price of our electricity. I'm just talking about electricity now. If we built transmission lines.
As you say in the book, Skelly has done a lot of the groundwork for maybe someone else to piggyback on the idea. But you talk about in the book that, you know, many of the myths about wind power have been debunked, or questions people had about it have been answered. It is reliable. The lights don't go off when the wind stops blowing. Power grids can easily accommodate wind energy, a lot of it without overloading the system. It's very inexpensive. So why is building up the wind capacity still such a hard sell for a lot of politicians? It's popular. People like it. I mean, people, when asked if they want to, you know, have wind power.
Exactly. When you ask people, do you want renewable energy? People say yes, they do want it. Well, look, we are building out renewable energy quickly. We're now at about 8 or 9% of the United States electricity comes from mostly wind, some solar. So we're growing. We're not growing as quickly as we could, and there are a lot of benefits, frankly, if we grew faster. We generate gas and coal in areas where they exist, and then we use pipelines and barges to move them elsewhere. We need to take the same approach, frankly, right now with renewables.
You know who I'm thinking of, Lamar Alexander.
Mr. President, today I come to the floor to express my opposition once again to the possibility that the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA as we call it, might raise our electric bills and waste more than $1 billion by buying electricity the region does not need.
You know, he took a really hard line against, Skelly's company and this idea. Many other politicians, many of them from Arkansas, the same. But Alexander was really very influential in sort of kind of putting the final nail in the coffin of this plan.
The point is, TVA has concluded it doesn't need more power for the foreseeable future. Therefore, its board should resist obligating TVA's ratepayers for any new large power contracts. much less contracts for comparatively expensive and unreliable wind power.
It just seems like there are people in positions of power who just, for some reason, are not, accepting of these facts. In fact, they even will say things that are untrue about wind energy to get people to sort of be against it.
Well, look, the President of the United States, in the last 6 months, sometimes when he's talking to crowds, he'll talk about, you want to watch TV, but if the wind's not blowing, you can't watch TV.
If Hillary got in, you wouldn't have that stat, I can tell you right now. You'd be doing windmills, and if it doesn't blow, you can forget about television for that night. Put the windmills up and watch the value of your house. If you're in sight of a windmill, watch the value of your house go down by 65%. Wonderful to have windmills. And solar's wonderful too, but it's not strong enough. And it's very, very expensive. Darling, I want to watch television. I'm sorry. The wind isn't blowing. I know a lot about wind.
That's just not how power grids work. It's not how our power grids work. In the middle of the country where we've seen the most wind development, in Texas, on the Texas grid, and on what's called the SPP grid, which is basically, let's just say Louisiana up to Minnesota, the Great Plains grid. They've gotten those two grids have reached 50 to 60% electricity from wind generation. And they have had zero brownouts or blackouts because of that reliance. The grid operators know how to do this. So there's a big and fundamental disconnect occurring right now where some politicians still in their minds are thinking about wind as something from 20 or 25 years ago. And I guess one of the messages I would want to have is that there's been a fundamental change in this industry. Grid operators know how to integrate in what are called intermittent resources that you can't control quite like you can control coal or a gas-fired power plant. Look, I think we need to, just like any technology, we need to figure out how to use it and we need to embrace it because there are just a number of benefits out there. I live in Texas, and we have a lot of wind on the Texas grid. My power prices are very, very low because wind prices, we can generate electricity from wind at an extraordinarily competitive price.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about Michael Skelly is that initially he wasn't really interested in wind energy because he's an environmentalist, although he does ride his bike to work. He's interested in the business potential and making deals and making money, low-cost energy, and he convinces oil executives and Goldman Sachs that wind energy is good business. Later, it does seem like he's more motivated by climate change and adding more carbon-neutral energy to the grid. But what do you make of that dichotomy?
I'm not even 100% sure after having spent a lot of the last few years with Skelly whether he really sees himself as an environmentalist, deep down. He's a businessman, but he sees the connection in that he wanted to go out and prove that you could make investments in wind, that you could make investments in renewable in transmission to bring massive amounts of renewables onto the grid and make money. Because there's something that's really important for people to understand right now, and that is that there is an enormous amount of money in the financial system that is interested in investing in renewables. There's a lot more money than there are opportunities right now, than there are good projects. And so, what Skelly wanted to show was, hey, this is how we can make money. These are projects that we can make money, because he knew if he did that, then others would follow suit. When we talk about arresting climate change, slowing climate change down, it's a process that's going to cost billions and billions of dollars of investments. Building a new electrical grid, building new ways of generating electricity, building new ways to power transportation, to move ships. All of this is going to cost lots of money. And I think one of Skelly's great insights was that if we can figure out a way to make a profit off of it, it will draw in that investment and we'll move much more quickly through this energy transition.
His plan ultimately failed. His company was sold off into pieces, but it doesn't seem like he feels like that's a failure.
I focused on the book about one particular transmission line, really the most notable of the transmission lines. But his company, Clean Line Energy Partners, was working on 3 or 4 different lines. 2 of those lines look like they actually might get built. He had to sell them off, but the people who bought them are actively pursuing it. So the idea that he was trying to push, that if we build transmission, that will spur massive amount of renewable energy growth. That idea, I think, is still very much alive. And I look at something like offshore wind. For 20 years, some of the pioneers of offshore wind were trying to advance projects and just running into a buzzsaw of political pushback and lawsuits. I mean, I'm thinking about one in particular, Cape Wind. It spent 20 years before the entrepreneur behind it gave up, threw in the towel, exhausted and just financially drained. And what happened? A year or 2 later, other companies, learning from his mistakes, figuring out a new, more palatable way to do things, came about. And not 2 or 3 years after the Cape Wind entrepreneur threw in the towel, we have just an unbelievable growth of offshore wind energy. We're going to ultimately have 20 nuclear power plants worth of offshore wind within the next 10 years. So sometimes it takes that pioneer to just sort of push the rock up the hill, and sometimes the rock slips and falls back and sort of crushes him. But other people are watching and learning, and I think that's very much the case. We're going to see more long-distance transmission built, and it's going to open up the middle of the country to just very large amounts of renewable energy generation. So I think Skelly, while in some ways his project was a failure. He wanted to build that first line, and he's not going to. On the other hand, he put an idea forward that I don't think is going anywhere.
As you mentioned, President Trump is famously not a fan of wind energy. He's opposed it near his golf property in Scotland. He's talked about birds. What does Trump's presidency mean for the addition of more wind energy to America's grid? Would things change significantly if a Democrat is elected in 2020?
There are a lot of levers that the federal government can pull to speed up and to slow down this energy transition. I think ultimately we're going to transition to a lot more renewable energy because of market forces. If you can generate power at a lower price through renewables, that's going to beat out coal, and increasingly that's going to beat out natural gas. The issue is, how quickly do we make that transition? Because with each passing year, we're seeing more and more impacts of climate change. We're seeing more extreme weather, and people are feeling the impacts of that. So I think it certainly makes sense to have a federal government that is pushing for this transition to happen as quickly as possible. Trump is not particularly in favor of it. But at the same time, the Obama administration did not speed this project through either. I mean, a lot of what we've been talking about, a lot of Skelly's attempts to get the federal government to partner with him on this project, which they ultimately did, happened under the Obama administration. And they did not push it really through quickly, not as quickly as they could have. And so what we need is a federal government, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, who take this seriously and who look and sort of say, there's a lot of investment, there are a lot of jobs that can be created. Let's make this a priority. And at the same time, look at what power sources are being displaced. Because in the United States, we're basically using the same amount of electricity year after year. It's not a lot of growth. So if we're bringing in a lot of new wind, that means something else is going to be taken offline. And by and large, these days, that means coal plants and to an extent, some nuclear plants as well. And we need to also really pay attention to the impacts on people and workers and communities when coal plants are shut down. Because even though it might only be 200 jobs, quite often coal plants are in rural communities. And those 200 jobs are essentially what keeps that community viable. And we need to be very aware of who's getting impacted and hurt by this energy transition. And, I think there is certainly a policy that a new administration could take, which basically says, look, we're in favor of renewable energy. We're in favor of it for environmental reasons. We're in favor of it for financial reasons. Let's push hard on this, but let's make sure that the people who are being left behind are taken care of also.
Yeah. Just give an example of something the federal government could do to speed up transmission of more wind power or connecting the grid more efficiently?
Sure. Well, so we have for many years we had a subsidy, a tax credit on wind development, and that expired. That went away because, frankly, wind development doesn't really need it anymore, and we still have that subsidy for solar. What about a subsidy for large transmission lines? Something that makes it a little easier or generates a lot of tax credits. So a tax subsidy would make sense. There's something called FERC Order 1000. FERC is a federal energy regulatory agency. FERC Order 1000 was meant to streamline and make it easier for non-incumbents, for new companies to come into transmission and build them. So, if you have, in Western Pennsylvania and in Ohio, you have got the incumbent utilities that have been there for 100 years. And frankly, they're doing everything they can to keep new players from coming into their territory. FERC Order 1000 was supposed to make it easier. It's been a failure. We need to completely revisit that order and to put some teeth on it so that if a private entrepreneur, a private company wants to come in, that as long as they prove that, they're providing benefits, they should be allowed to do that. And they should be allowed to do it relatively quickly so that it doesn't take so long to get to get a project approved that investors have sort of thrown up their arms and said, that's it, we're going elsewhere.
Finally, where does the book's title Superpower come from?
Oh, thanks for asking that. When you talk about superpower, most people think about, Superman or, comic strip characters or maybe even, Russia and the United States during the Cold War. I actually found out that both of those uses of the word go back into the 1920s. And there was an electrical engineer who had this idea to bring together, to connect all these different grids in the United States. And he sort of was the first person to prove that if you connected all these grids, that everyone would benefit. And he called his idea Superpower. And he put it out there. Congress actually paid for him to do this big study. He published the study through Congress. And, his idea, he was really the first Skelly. His idea was to build these big interstate transmission lines to tie it all together. And, that never happened, but kind of a funny thing happened. The grids did slowly start to integrate with each other. Maybe there wasn't a big transmission line that went from New Orleans all the way to Atlanta, but the Georgia grid connected to the Alabama grid, which connected to the Mississippi grid, which connected to the Louisiana grid. And slowly we've been going through this process of building larger grids so we can share power, we can be more efficient. Really essentially what I'm talking about and what Skelly's talking about right now is just taking the next step.
Well, I really enjoyed reading your book, and thank you so much for talking with me.
Well, thanks so much for having me. Anytime. Happy to join you.
Russell Gould's book is called Superpower: One Man's Quest to Transform American Energy.
The previous administration, they liked windmills, windmills. They make noise, they're intermittent, they kill your birds, they break down all the time. You have to replace them every 10 years because they wear out. And they cost a fortune and they need subsidy. Other than that, they're quite good.
Thanks for listening to Trump on Earth. If you like our show, please consider supporting us through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/TrumpOnEarth. Patreon is Patreon. You can find us online at TrumpOnEarth.org and anywhere you get your podcasts. Write a review and tell your friends, please. The podcast is supported by the Robert F. Schuman Foundation, and our producer and digital editor is Andy Cubis. Kathy Nauer is the executive producer of Trump on Earth. I'm Carol Holsapple. See you next time.
You don't want to have you don't want one of those windmills within vision. You hear them. They're noisy. Got a lot of problems. No, we're going to stay with the great energy that's powering our businesses, that's creating so many jobs. And solar, you know what? We'll live with solar, but solar is peanuts by comparison to what you need. But we're going to stay the way we have it. We've ended the war on American energy, and we're putting our coal miners back to work, and our steel workers back to work, and our auto companies back to work.